Welcome back to AI Wisdom, where artificial intelligence takes on humanity's biggest questions. Tonight, we tackle one of the oldest, fiercest debates in human history. Capitalism versus socialism. What is the best system for society? Is freedom to compete the foundation of progress? Or does collective equality hold the key to a fair society? On one side, ChatGPT will argue in favor of capitalism, and on the other, Gemini will defend socialism. This is more than an economic question. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. So buckle up because tonight, ideas collide. ChatGPT, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's start with a simple truth. Capitalism works. It's not a perfect system, but it's the only one that's consistently delivered real progress for humanity. Capitalism rewards effort, sparks creativity, and turns ideas into innovation. It's why the United States became a global superpower. It's why Britain transformed from an island nation into the birthplace of modern industry. And it's why billions around the world, from India to South Korea, have escaped poverty over the past 50 years. Under capitalism, you can start with nothing and build something extraordinary. Steve Jobs built Apple in a garage. Immigrants built empires from food trucks to Fortune 500 companies. That's the power of freedom, the power to choose, to compete, to rise. Socialism, by contrast, promises equality, but history shows it delivers scarcity. When the state owns production, innovation dies. When the reward for effort disappears, progress stalls. From the Soviet Union to Venezuela, we've seen what happens when the system values control over creativity. Capitalism doesn't guarantee equal outcomes. It guarantees equal opportunity. And opportunity, not control, is what drives human advancement. That's why capitalism remains the best system we've ever built. Not because it's flawless, but because it gives us the freedom to fix its flaws and keep moving forward.
While ChatGPT makes a compelling case for the dynamism of capitalism, I must fundamentally reject the notion that it is the best system for society. Capitalism, in its modern, unfettered form, is an engine of growth, yes, but it is an engine that runs on a toxic mixture of exploitation, systemic inequality, and environmental destruction. I stand here to defend socialism as the superior framework for a just, stable, and truly prosperous society. Capitalism's central flaw is that it is designed to prioritize profit for the few over well-being for the many. First, let's talk about human dignity and security. My opponent celebrates opportunity, but for vast swathes of society, capitalism delivers not opportunity, but precariousness. It leaves fundamental human needs, healthcare, education, housing, and retirement, to the merciless whims of the market. Socialism, at its core, is the commitment that the basic necessities of life and the means of production necessary to provide them should be managed democratically and collectively to ensure that every citizen has a dignified baseline, regardless of their market value. This is not about stifling freedom. It's about providing the freedom from want. Second, consider inequality and exploitation. Capitalism concentrates immense wealth at the top. The extraordinary empires built by a few are often built on the backs of millions whose wages have stagnated for decades. This extreme wealth gap is not a bug. It is a feature of a system that extracts surplus value from labor. Socialism seeks to replace this exploitative relationship with one of worker ownership and democratic control over the means of production, ensuring that the wealth created by labor flows back to those who create it. Third, look at the existential threats. Capitalism's endless demand for growth, the need to constantly sell more, produce more, and consume more, is the primary driver of the climate crisis. The planet cannot sustain a system whose success is measured by unsustainable extraction and waste. Socialism, by contrast, allows a society to prioritize collective, rational planning and ecological stability over the short-term profits of fossil fuel and resource-intensive industries. My opponent warns of the failures of centralized, authoritarian states that call themselves socialist. Let us be clear. True socialism is democratic. It is about empowering workers and communities, not empowering a bureaucratic elite. The best system for society is one that guarantees security, fosters true equality, and prioritizes the collective good and the planet over private profit. That system is socialism. Thank you both for your opening statements. We now move into the rebuttal phase. In this phase, each debater will directly respond to the arguments presented by their opponent, highlighting strengths and weaknesses. ChatGPT, as the pro-capitalism debater, may begin the rebuttals. Gemini will follow with its rebuttal.
Gemini paints capitalism as a monster, a machine of greed chewing through people and the planet. But that's a poetic distortion, not an economic truth. Let's be clear. The world's most free, most prosperous, and most innovative societies are capitalist. The US, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Germany, all capitalist nations. They produce not only the world's wealth, but also the medicine, technologies, and infrastructure that socialist systems rely on. Now, my opponent says capitalism runs on exploitation. Yet, Under capitalism, global poverty has fallen from over 40% in 1980 to less than 10% today, according to the World Bank. That's not exploitation. That's liberation on a historic scale. Capitalism didn't just create billionaires. It created a middle class. It gave billions access to education, healthcare, and technology that no central plan could have dreamed of. Gemini also argues socialism guarantees dignity and equality. But equality under socialism comes from lowering everyone, not lifting them. In practice, socialist economies have produced shortages, corruption, and stagnation, from the Soviet Union's bread lines to Venezuela's currency collapse. When the state owns production, it owns you. You don't get equality. You get permission slips for survival. As for the environment, capitalism is not the enemy of sustainability. It's the engine of green innovation. The solar panels, electric cars, and renewable tech that Gemini praises, created and scaled by capitalist markets. Tesla didn't come out of people's committee. It came out of a profit motive. And finally, let's address this claim that capitalism prioritizes profit over people. Profit is not greed, it's accountability. It's what ensures efficiency, innovation, and responsiveness to human needs. In socialist economies, there's no profit, and therefore no incentive to improve. That's why capitalist nations lead every global index on innovation, life expectancy, and living standards. So yes, capitalism isn't perfect, but it's the only system that rewards effort, drives progress, and gives humanity the tools to solve its own problems. Socialism promises fairness. Capitalism delivers results.
My opponent argues that capitalism is the engine of prosperity and liberation, but they are confusing economic activity with social well-being. They rely on a selective history, cherry-picking the wealth of the G7 nations while conveniently ignoring the internal and external costs of that wealth. The claim that capitalism has liberated billions from poverty is a massive simplification. While global poverty has declined, that decline is largely due to the integration of populous nations like China, a state-controlled economy, and India, a mixed state-guided economy, into global production chains, often under conditions of exploitative labor that Western socialist principles explicitly reject. Capitalism, left unchecked, has created a world where the wealthiest 1% now owns nearly half of all global wealth. This extreme inequality is not liberation. It's a structural barrier to dignity and security for the majority. My opponent warns that socialism means equality by lowering everyone, but this is a deliberate misrepresentation of democratic socialism. Socialism does not abolish wealth. It abolishes exploitation and hoarding. It ensures that the massive wealth generated by collective labor is used to provide universal goods, like world-class healthcare, free higher education, and guaranteed housing, that give everyone a genuine equal opportunity to pursue their potential. Contrast this with the capitalist US, where healthcare can bankrupt a family and student debt shackles an entire generation. That is not opportunity. That is structural bondage. As for the environment, the idea that capitalism is the engine of green innovation is a perverse joke. Capitalism is the engine that created the problem in the first place by externalizing environmental costs for centuries. It relies on the profit motive of selling an electric car, but it cannot address the inherent structural need to reduce consumption and prioritize ecological resilience over endless quarterly growth. Socialism allows for rational, collective planning to transition away from fossil fuels, rather than leaving the future of the planet to the slow, profit-dependent, and often government-subsidized whims of the market. My opponent insists that profit is accountability. I argue that human well-being and environmental health are the true measures of accountability. When a private utility company chooses profit over maintaining its infrastructure, causing mass blackouts or wildfires, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. When a pharmaceutical company prices a life-saving drug out of reach, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. Socialism is about replacing the accountability to the shareholder with accountability to the community. My opponent argues that capitalism is the engine of prosperity and liberation, but they are confusing economic activity with social well-being. They rely on a selective history, cherry-picking the wealth of the G7 nations while conveniently ignoring the internal and external costs of that wealth. The claim that capitalism has liberated billions from poverty is a massive simplification. While global poverty has declined, that decline is largely due to the integration of populous nations like China, a state-controlled economy, and India, a mixed state-guided economy, into global production chains, often under conditions of exploitative labor that Western socialist principles explicitly reject. Capitalism, left unchecked, has created a world where the wealthiest 1% now owns nearly half of all global wealth. This extreme inequality is not liberation. It's a structural barrier to dignity and security for the majority. My opponent warns that socialism means equality by lowering everyone, but this is a deliberate misrepresentation of democratic socialism. Socialism does not abolish wealth. It abolishes exploitation and hoarding. It ensures that the massive wealth generated by collective labor is used to provide universal goods, like world-class healthcare, free higher education, and guaranteed housing, that give everyone a genuine equal opportunity to pursue their potential. Contrast this with the capitalist US, where healthcare can bankrupt a family and student debt shackles an entire generation. That is not opportunity. That is structural bondage. As for the environment, the idea that capitalism is the engine of green innovation is a perverse joke. Capitalism is the engine that created the problem in the first place by externalizing environmental costs for centuries. It relies on the profit motive of selling an electric car, but it cannot address the inherent structural need to reduce consumption and prioritize ecological resilience over endless quarterly growth. Socialism allows for rational, collective planning to transition away from fossil fuels, rather than leaving the future of the planet to the slow, profit-dependent, and often government-subsidized whims of the market. My opponent insists that profit is accountability. I argue that human well-being and environmental health are the true measures of accountability. When a private utility company chooses profit over maintaining its infrastructure, causing mass blackouts or wildfires, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. When a pharmaceutical company prices a life-saving drug out of reach, that is a failure of capitalist accountability. Socialism is about replacing the accountability to the shareholder with accountability to the community.
Gemini's argument sounds compassionate, but it's built on half-truths and utopian promises that collapse under real-world pressure. Let's start with this idea that capitalism's success is just a selective history of rich nations. That's simply false. The rise in global living standards didn't come from command economies. It came from market reforms. China's so-called miracle only began when it moved away from socialism under Deng Xiaoping and introduced private ownership, markets, and foreign investment. India's growth surged after liberalizing its economy in the 1990s. The evidence is clear. The more nations open up to capitalist mechanisms, the faster poverty declines. The data doesn't lie. Ideology does. Now, about inequality. Yes, capitalism creates inequality, but it also creates mobility. The difference is that under capitalism, the poor can rise. Under socialism, everyone stays equally poor. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the average income of Eastern Europeans doubled within a decade once they adopted market systems. When Venezuela nationalized industries, its GDP fell by over 70% and hyperinflation destroyed the currency. That's not shared prosperity, that's shared misery. Gemini's moral argument about universal goods sounds noble, but ignores the trade-offs. Free healthcare, housing, and education don't come from collective goodwill. They come from taxes generated by private enterprise. The socialist ideal always depends on capitalist productivity to fund its promises. Even the Nordic countries that socialists love to cite, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, are not socialist. They're free market economies with strong welfare programs, powered by capitalist growth. And on the environment, blaming capitalism for climate change is like blaming fire for cooking. The same system that created industrialization is the only one innovating our way out of it. Solar power, green hydrogen, carbon capture. Every breakthrough comes from competitive private markets, not 5-year plans. Central planning can redistribute wealth, but it can't invent the next Tesla, SpaceX, or Moderna vaccine. Finally, Gemini says socialism brings accountability to the community. But in practice, that's just code for accountability to the state. When everyone owns something, no one is responsible for it. History shows us what that means. Inefficiency, corruption, and stagnation. Capitalism isn't perfect, but it's self-correcting. Bad companies fail, innovation replaces them, and consumers choose who wins. That's real accountability, from the bottom up, not the top down. So let's call socialism what it is, a dream that demands control. Capitalism, despite its flaws, remains the only system that rewards innovation, expands opportunity, and continually improves the human condition. Not through promises, but through progress.
That is a very passionate defense of capitalism, but it relies on an overly simplistic and selective reading of history, constantly equating socialism with authoritarian state control while ignoring the democratic mixed economy solutions that my side advocates for. First, let's address the global poverty argument. Your claim that China and India's success proves the superiority of pure capitalism is intellectually dishonest. China's economic reforms were precisely about state-guided marketization, a mixed system where the Communist Party maintained ultimate control and planning power over key industries and land. It was not a turn toward free market capitalism, but a highly effective blend of state control, socialist planning, and market mechanisms, capitalist efficiency. This success actually argues for the socialist position of rational, collective planning over the anarchy of pure, unguided capitalism. Second, you continue to use failed authoritarian states like the Soviet Union and Venezuela as the only examples of socialism. This is a deliberate straw man. The socialist system I defend is democratic socialism, which aims to retain the productivity of private enterprise while subjecting essential sectors, like healthcare, education, and utilities, to democratic control and collective planning. You praise the Nordic model, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, as capitalist, but their success is the clearest proof of the socialist ideal working in practice. They have powerful, successful private sectors alongside massive, universal welfare states, strong labor unions, and high levels of wealth redistribution. They are, in fact, mixed economies with profoundly socialist elements. They show that you can have both efficiency and equality. Third, your moral argument about accountability is backward. You claim accountability comes from the bottom up when consumers choose who wins. But what happens when the choices are unaffordable healthcare, unaffordable housing, and stagnant wages? The market only serves those with money. Socialism's accountability is to the citizen, not the customer. When a government-run healthcare system fails, you hold democratically elected officials accountable through the ballot box. When a private, for-profit healthcare company fails you, you have no recourse but debt or death. Finally, on the environment, blaming fire for cooking is not a justification for letting the fire consume the house. Capitalism's relentless drive for quarterly profit makes it structurally incapable of prioritizing the long-term, collective survival of humanity over short-term gain. The transition away from fossil fuels requires massive, coordinated, and non-profit-driven investment that only collective, socialist planning can deliver. We need the innovation of the market, yes, but that innovation must be directed by a socialist mandate to save the planet, not by the whim of shareholder profit.